I gave up my $300,000 a year job to care for my dying mother. I traded a life of innovation in Silicon Valley for sponge baths and medication schedules, and I never once regretted it. But in my own father's eyes, I wasn't a daughter making a sacrifice. I was just a new expense on his balance sheet. I thought her passing would be the greatest pain I'd ever feel. I was wrong. The real heartbreak was yet to come. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from. And if you haven't already, make sure you hit that subscribe button. The scent of antiseptic and stale air. That's the smell I remember most from that final year. It clung to the floral wallpaper of my childhood bedroom in our Pennsylvania home, a constant reminder of the life I had left behind and the life that was fading away in the room next to mine. My name is Dr. Evelyn Reed. At 42 years old, I was supposed to be at the peak of my career, a data security analyst with a spacious apartment in Palo Alto. Instead, I was an expert in measuring morphine doses and fluffing pillows. My mother, Helen, was the reason I came home. A cruel, slow-moving cancer had tethered her to a hospital bed we'd set up in the living room. Her world had shrunk to those four walls, and so had mine. My days were a quiet rhythm of her needs. Changing her sheets, reading her favorite poems, or just holding her frail hand, its warmth a fading echo of the strong woman who had raised me. It was a sacred duty, a final act of love I felt privileged to perform. My father Arthur saw it differently. He'd walk into the room after a day at the bank, his tie still perfectly knotted, his gaze sweeping over the medical equipment with a quiet disapproval. He never said it directly, but his sighs were as loud as shouts. He saw the oxygen concentrator not as a source of life, but as a drain on the electricity bill. He saw the hospice nurse not as a comfort, but as an hourly expense. I remember one Tuesday afternoon, the specialist had suggested a new experimental drug. It wasn't a cure, just a chance to ease her pain a little more. The insurance wouldn't cover it. Arthur stood by the window, looking out at the manicured lawn he was so proud of. "It's not covered by the insurance, Evelyn," he said, his voice flat. "It's draining us." There was no us. I had been paying for her medication, for the special dietary supplements, for the nurse's extra hours, all from my own savings. The nest egg I had meticulously built for my own future was now being liquidated for my mother's present. I didn't mind. It was my money to give. "I'll take care of it, Dad," I said, my voice even. I didn't want to cause a fight in front of Mom. He just nodded, a flicker of relief in his eyes that made my stomach turn. He never asked where the money came from. He never asked what I had given up. He just accepted it as if it were his due. My silent sacrifice was simply an expected transaction in his cold, orderly world. In those moments, I felt utterly invisible, not a person, but a solution to a financial problem. Every line of code I ever wrote felt meaningless compared to the simple act of holding my mother's hand. I knew it was a sacrifice. I just didn't know I was the only one paying the price. The greatest wounds aren't always inflicted by a single dramatic blow. Sometimes they are the result of 1,000 tiny cuts, so small you barely notice them until you're bleeding out. My father was a master of this quiet warfare. His weapon of choice was not his voice, but his ledger. I remember one evening, a few weeks before the end. The house was still filled with the soft, rhythmic puffing of my mother's oxygen machine. I was in the kitchen washing the dinner dishes when I saw my father at the table. He wasn't reading a book or watching the news. He had a small pile of receipts spread out before him, along with a pen and a calculator auditing our life as if it were a quarterly report. His finger stopped on one slip of paper from the local pharmacy. "Evelyn," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the house. "This line item here. The refill for your mother's pain medication. The cost has increased by $12 since last month." I stopped scrubbing my hands submerged in the warm, soapy water. I felt a familiar wave of exhaustion wash over me. I could explain. I could tell him that the pharmacy's supplier had changed, that prices fluctuate, that $12 was a pittance in the grand scheme of things. But I knew it was useless. An argument would follow. His voice would rise, and the sound would carry into the living room, disturbing the fragile peace my mother so desperately needed. It was a battle I couldn't afford to fight. "I'll look into it, Dad," I replied, my voice betraying no emotion. "I'll see if I can find a better price." He seemed satisfied with that, making a neat little note on his pad before moving on to the grocery bill. He didn't see the lie. The next day, I didn't just look into it. I drove 20 miles to a different pharmacy in the next town, over one where he wouldn't think to check. I paid for my mother's refill, not with a credit card that would leave a paper trail, but with the cash I had taken from my own wallet. The pharmacist gave me a receipt, and as soon as I was back in my car, I crumpled it into a tight little ball and stuffed it into the bottom of my purse. Driving home, I felt a profound sense of sadness. It wasn't about the money. It was about the secrecy. It was the fact that I had to hide an act of love, an act of care for my own mother, to protect her from the cold arithmetic of my father. These were the invisible cuts, the small secret sacrifices that no one ever saw, but that carved away at your soul piece by piece until you wondered how much of you was even left. There is a sound that silence makes when a life leaves a room. It's not an absence of noise. It's a presence, a heavy, suffocating weight that presses down on you, making it hard to breathe. My mother passed on a Tuesday morning, just as the sun was beginning to warm the window panes. It was peaceful. I was holding her hand, and in one moment, there was a faint, shallow breath, and in the next, there was only that profound, crushing silence. The candle had finally gone out. The funeral was 3 days later. It was a blur of black suits, sympathetic murmurs, and wilting flower arrangements. People I hadn't seen in years came to pat my shoulder and tell me what a wonderful woman my mother had been. I nodded and thanked them, my voice a hollow echo of someone else's. My focus kept drifting to my father. He stood near the entrance of the chapel, a pillar of stoic grief. He shook hands firmly, accepted condolences with a solemn nod, and spoke of my mother in fond, measured tones. He played the part of the grieving widower perfectly, but I saw what others didn't. I saw the way his eyes never quite met anyone else's, how they scanned the room as if he were managing an event, not mourning a loss. He wasn't heartbroken. He was inconvenienced. The true testament to his character came later that day back at the house. The last of the relatives had departed, leaving behind a half-eaten tray of sandwiches and an even deeper silence than before. I was standing in the living room, staring at the now empty hospital bed, when Arthur walked in, rolling up his sleeves. "Well, that's that," he said, his voice brisk. "First thing tomorrow, I'll call the rental company to come get this bed. We'll need to sort through her things, of course. No sense in dragging it out." He spoke of dismantling my mother's life as if he were planning a weekend project. He talked about canceling her magazine subscriptions, updating the bank accounts, and getting a quote to have the carpets professionally cleaned. Each word was a logistical step, a task to be checked off a list. There was no mention of her favorite books, no story about the chipped teacup. She loved no acknowledgement of the void she had left behind. He was erasing her. Methodically, efficiently, he was scrubbing away the last traces of her existence. I stood there, surrounded by the scent of her, the echo of her presence in every corner, and I had never felt so alone. I had lost my mother, but that day I realized I had also lost my father long ago. I was grieving for two people, but only one of them was gone. The other was standing right in front of me, calculating the cost of moving on. The weeks between the funeral and Christmas were like living in a vacuum. The house grew quieter, but the silence was different now. It was a hostile silence, charged with unspoken resentment. The hospital bed was gone, the medical supplies cleared away, and the scent of antiseptic had been replaced by the sterile, lemon-scented polish my father used on the furniture. He had succeeded in erasing my mother's final days, and with them my purpose for being there. I tried to bridge the chasm between us. I'd ask him about his day at the bank, a question he would answer with a single clipped sentence. I'd offer to cook his favorite meal, an offer he would decline by saying he planned to eat out. I was a ghost in my own childhood home, drifting through rooms filled with memories that only I seemed to value. My presence was a constant, unwelcome reminder of the life he was eager to leave behind. I was the last loose end in his neatly organized world. I represented the past, the illness, the expense. He wanted to move forward, and I was the anchor holding him back. I could feel his impatience growing with each passing day. It wasn't in his words, but in the way he would pointedly check his watch when I was on the phone with a friend, or the way he would sigh heavily when he saw me sitting in what used to be my mother's favorite armchair. I spent most of my time in my old bedroom, surrounded by dusty yearbooks and forgotten posters. My laptop was my only real connection to the outside world, to the life I once had. I started taking on small freelance coding projects, not for the money, but for the sanity. The logical, predictable world of data and algorithms was a refuge from the emotional minefield downstairs. It was a way to remind myself that I was still Dr. Evelyn Reed, that I still had a skill, a mind, a value beyond what my father saw. The tension in the house became so thick, you could almost taste it. We moved around each other like two opposing magnets, creating a field of invisible force that kept us from ever truly connecting. The air crackled with things left unsaid. He never asked me about my plans. He never asked if I was okay. He never acknowledged my grief. And in his deliberate avoidance, he made his message clear. My time here was running out. The storm was coming. I just didn't realize it was scheduled to arrive on Christmas Day. Christmas Day arrived not with joy, but with a quiet, suffocating obligation. The house was decorated, but it felt like a stage set for a play no one wanted to perform. There were no carols playing, no scent of baking from the kitchen. Our dinner was a store-bought roast beef, its plastic wrapping a sad testament to the holiday spirit we lacked. We sat at opposite ends of the long dining table, the empty chairs between us, like tombstones for the family we once were. The only sounds were the scrape of a knife against a plate and the formal ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. The silence was so heavy, it felt like a physical presence, a third person seated at our table. I focused on cutting my food into impossibly small pieces, anything to avoid looking at him. Halfway through the meal, he put down his fork. The small clatter of silver on porcelain sounded like a gunshot in the still room. He cleared his throat, a gesture he always made before a formal pronouncement at the bank. "Evelyn," he said, his voice void of any warmth. "I have been thinking about the future. My future. And it's time for me to start my new life." I looked up, a flicker of confusion in my chest. For a moment, a foolish, naive part of me thought he was going to say something about us, about healing, about moving forward together. His eyes met mine across the table, and they were as cold and hard as river stones in winter. "Your mother is gone," he stated, as if delivering a weather report. "You have no reason to be here freeloading anymore." The word freeloading hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was a single venomous word that erased 2 years of my life, 2 years of sacrifice, of holding my mother's hand as she slipped away. The air seemed to get thick and heavy, and I could feel the blood drain from my face. He wasn't finished. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a low, deliberate tone, ensuring every syllable landed with maximum impact. "You are a burden. Get out of my house." The clock in the hall kept ticking. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic trapped bird. But on the outside, I was frozen. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I could only stare at him, the man who was my father, as he delivered my sentence. And then he did the most monstrous thing of all. He picked up his knife and fork, and with a steady hand, he calmly cut another piece of his roast beef. He brought it to his mouth, chewed, and swallowed. For him, the conversation was over. The problem was solved. He had just shattered my world, and he was already finishing his dinner. Something inside me broke at that dinner table. But it didn't shatter into a million tearful pieces. It snapped. It hardened. The part of me that felt pain, that craved approval, that held onto the ghost of a family, simply went silent. In its place, a cold, quiet clarity took over. My legs moved. My chair scraped against the wood floor. I stood up. My father did not look at me. He kept his eyes on his plate as if my very existence had already been wiped from the room. I didn't say a word. There were no words left to say. To argue would be to admit that his opinion still mattered. To cry would be a waste of energy. I turned and walked out of the dining room. Each step up the grand staircase was deliberate, my hand gliding along the polished banister my mother had loved so much. I felt nothing. It was just wood beneath my fingers. In my room, I moved with a strange, methodical calm. I pulled out a single black suitcase, the one I used for business trips. I didn't rummage through my closet or linger over old photographs. I packed with the detached efficiency of a soldier preparing for deployment. 3 sets of practical clothes, a toothbrush, and my laptop, the one thing in that house that was truly mine. It represented my mind, my skill, my escape. It was the only weapon I had. I zipped the suitcase shut. The sound was definitive, a final clean break. As I walked back down the stairs, I could see him through the doorway, still seated at the head of the table alone. He was a king in a kingdom of one. He didn't look up. He didn't have to. He had already won. I stepped out the front door into the biting cold of the Christmas night. The air was sharp and clean and a welcome shock to my system. As the heavy door clicked shut behind me, the sound didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a starting gun. I didn't look back. I got in my car, placed my single suitcase on the passenger seat, and drove away. The festive lights of the neighborhood blurred in my rearview mirror, fading into the darkness. The grief was gone. The hurt was gone. All that remained was a core of pure, unyielding steel. I drove for hours with no destination in mind. The monotonous rhythm of the highway was a balm. Each mile marker, a small victory, putting more distance between me and the cold, silent judgment of that dining room. The polished suburbs of Pennsylvania dissolved into the rolling hills of Maryland, then the dense forests of Virginia. I was a ship without a rudder, guided only by an instinct to keep moving south towards a place where no one knew my name. After 2 days in a sterile roadside motel, I knew I couldn't just keep running. I needed a base, a fortress, a place where I could not just exist, but rebuild. That night, hunched over my laptop, I found it. It was a listing for a small wooden cabin, a tiny speck on a map nestled deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The description was simple: secluded, quiet, no neighbors for miles. It was perfect. The drive up the mountain was on a winding gravel road that seemed to climb forever. When I finally arrived, the cabin was exactly as promised. It was small, made of dark, weathered wood, with a wide porch that looked out over a vast valley of green and blue haze. The air here was different. It didn't smell of lemon polish and regret. It smelled of pine-damp earth and an indifferent, cleansing wind. Inside the cabin was rustic and honest. The floors creaked. The fireplace was made of rough gray stone. There was a simple wooden table, a single armchair, and a small bedroom. It was the complete opposite of the house I had left behind. That house was a museum of unspoken rules and polished surfaces. This cabin was a blank slate. It expected nothing from me. It held no memories, no judgment. I dropped my single suitcase by the door. I walked over to the large picture window and looked out at the endless expanse of mountains. For the first time since my mother's illness began, I felt like I could breathe. The heavy weight that had been sitting on my chest for years began to lift, not entirely, but enough for me to notice its absence. This wouldn't be a place of rest. It would be my command center. That evening, as darkness fell over the valley, I didn't bother unpacking my clothes. I walked over to the simple wooden table, opened my laptop, and plugged it in. The screen flared to life, its cool, blue-white light cutting through the cabin's darkness. It was the only light for miles around. In the quiet solitude of the Virginia mountains, my new life had just begun. In the quiet of that mountain cabin, I didn't give myself time to grieve or to rage. That was a luxury I couldn't afford. Instead, I channeled every ounce of my pain, every memory of my father's cold dismissal, into a single focused objective. I built my new world line by line, keystroke by keystroke. I gave my new company a name, Aegis Analytics. The Aegis was a legendary shield, a symbol of divine protection. That's what I would offer. Protection in a world of digital chaos. My first task was creating a digital infrastructure from scratch. I built a secure website, drafted service agreements, and set up encrypted communication channels. The work was complex and all-consuming, a welcome distraction from the ghosts of the past. My days became a blur of black coffee. In blue light, the sun rising and setting outside my window as I hunted for clients. It was humbling. I was Dr. Evelyn Reed, a woman who once had recruiters begging for her attention. Now, I was just another anonymous email in a crowded inbox, another profile on freelance platforms. I sent out dozens of proposals, made cold calls to small businesses, and faced a wall of silence. For every 10 emails I sent, maybe one would receive a polite rejection. The rest were simply ignored. There were moments of doubt that crept in during the dead of night when the coffee wore off and the loneliness of the cabin felt immense. I would stare at the ceiling, my father's words echoing in the darkness. "You are a burden." Maybe he was right. Maybe I was just a washed-up analyst playing pretend in the woods. But then dawn would break, and the steely resolve would return. I would brew another pot of coffee and get back to work. I refused to let his voice be the one that defined me. And then after 3 solid weeks of relentless effort, it happened. An email appeared in my inbox. It wasn't a rejection. It was from a small credit union in Ohio. Their internal security team was overwhelmed, and they needed a third party to conduct a routine security audit on their new mobile banking app. The pay was modest, a fraction of what I used to make in a single day. But it wasn't about the money. It was a chance. It was a beginning. I read the email 3 times just to be sure it was real. A slow, deep breath filled my lungs, the first one that didn't feel heavy with sorrow. A faint ghost of a smile touched my lips. It wasn't triumph. It was validation. Someone was willing to pay for my expertise. I was not a burden. I was a professional. Aegis Analytics had just landed its first client. The first brick had been laid. That first contract from the Ohio Credit Union was more than just a job. It was the crack in the dam. I poured everything I had into it. I worked 18-hour days fueled by a determination that bordered on obsession. I didn't just audit their system. I dismantled it, analyzed every line of code, and rebuilt their security protocols from the ground up, making them stronger, faster, and more resilient. I delivered a final report that was so comprehensive, so detailed, that the credit union's president called me personally to express his gratitude. He also referred me to 2 other regional banks in his network. Word of mouth in the niche world of financial cybersecurity is more valuable than any marketing campaign. My work for that small credit union became my calling card. The report I wrote was quietly passed from one chief technology officer to another. Suddenly, the emails I received weren't polite rejections anymore. They were inquiries. Aegis Analytics began to grow. First, it was a slow trickle. A mid-sized bank in Kentucky, a financial advisory firm in Tennessee. Each project was bigger than the last. I delivered on every single one, exceeding expectations, building a reputation for being meticulous, relentless, and discreet. I was no longer just a freelancer. I was a specialist. 6 months after leaving my father's house, I was drowning in work. The days were no longer long enough. I knew I couldn't do it alone anymore. It was time to expand. I posted a single job opening online for a junior analyst seeking someone with raw talent and a hunger to learn. I received over 100 applications. I conducted the interviews via video call from my cabin. The applicant who stood out was a young woman named Sarah. She was brilliant, a recent graduate from Georgia Tech, but what I saw in her was a familiar fire. She was quietly confident, overlooked by the big Silicon Valley firms who favored swagger over substance. She didn't want a job. She wanted a mission. I hired her on the spot. Sarah worked remotely from her apartment in Atlanta, but we were a seamless team. I would handle the high-level strategy and client relations, and she would execute the deep-dive analytics. Together, we were a formidable force. A full year had now passed since that Christmas dinner. Aegis Analytics was no longer a desperate hope operating out of a remote cabin. It was a respected, profitable business. We had a portfolio of 16 clients across the financial sector. I had moved from my tiny cabin to a larger, more permanent home, with a dedicated office still nestled in the mountains, but a home nonetheless. The scars from my father's words were still there, but they were no longer gaping wounds. They were faint silver lines, reminders of a battle I had survived. I was building my own legacy, one secure server at a time. There was a moment, about 18 months into my new life, that I'll never forget. It wasn't a moment of victory or a major business deal. It was something much quieter. It was a Tuesday evening in late autumn. I was standing on the deck of my new house, a mug of hot tea warming my hands. The sun had just dipped below the jagged peaks of the Blue Ridge, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves. Down in the valley, a blanket of mist was beginning to settle, softening the edges of the world. My work for the day was done. Sarah and I had just finalized a major security overhaul for a client in Florida. My bank account was healthier than it had ever been, even during my best years in Silicon Valley. Aegis Analytics was a success by every conceivable measure. But in that moment, none of that mattered. I wasn't thinking about code or clients or profit margins. I was just watching the mountains. I watched as the last embers of sunlight faded and the deep velvet black of night took over. I listened to the rhythmic chorus of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. I felt the cool mountain breeze on my face. And I felt peace. It was a profound, bone-deep tranquility that I hadn't realized I'd been missing. It was a peace that came not from success, but from self-reliance. It was the quiet confidence of knowing that I had faced the absolute worst, that I had been cast out and called a burden, and I had not only survived, I had built something from the ashes. I had built it myself. I thought about my father, then a fleeting, distant thought. I wondered what he was doing. Was he sitting in his perfectly ordered house, watching the evening news? Did he ever think of me a year ago? That thought would have brought a sharp, twisting pain. But now, it felt like a memory from someone else's life. His judgment, His words, his cold, dismissive glare, they no longer had power over me. The chains had rusted and fallen away so quietly I hadn't even noticed. I was ready. I didn't know what was coming next, what new challenges lay over the horizon. But standing there alone on my mountain, I knew with an unshakable certainty that whatever it was, I could handle it. The fire had tested me and it hadn't burned me down. It had forged me into something stronger. The storm arrived on a Wednesday morning, not in the sky above my mountain, but on the screen of my laptop. It started as a whisper, a single headline on a financial news site. Pennsylvania Commonwealth Bank hit by major cyberattack. I froze my coffee cup halfway to my lips. Pennsylvania Commonwealth Bank, PCB, my father's bank. I clicked the link. The details were sparse but alarming. The bank's entire digital infrastructure was paralyzed. Online banking was down. ATMs were offline. Internal systems were inaccessible. It was a complete and total blackout. The article quoted a panicked spokesperson who offered vague assurances while admitting they were facing an unprecedented crisis. My first feeling was a strange, clinical detachment. I read the article not as a daughter, but as a professional. I analyzed the language, the type of outage described, and my mind immediately started building a threat profile. It wasn't a simple, distributed denial of service attack. The complete paralysis of internal systems pointed to something far more insidious: ransomware, a particularly vicious strain that didn't just lock systems, but burrowed deep into the core, encrypting everything it touched. I leaned back in my chair, the coffee forgotten. My father had worked at that bank for 40 years. It was his pride, his kingdom. His entire professional identity was tied up in its reputation for stability and security. And now that reputation was being dismantled in real time for the entire world to see. A part of me, a small, dark part, I was ashamed to acknowledge, felt a flicker of grim satisfaction. It was karma delivered with brutal digital efficiency. He, the man who worshipped order and control, was now at the mercy of absolute chaos. But that feeling was quickly replaced by something else. A complex, churning mix of emotions I couldn't quite name. It wasn't pity, it wasn't concern, it was a feeling of inevitability. As if the last 2 years of my life, the quiet rebuilding, the relentless work, had all been leading to this precise moment. The universe was bending back on itself, pulling two ends of a broken string together. I opened a new tab on my browser and started a deep dive pulling raw data from security forums and dark web chatter. I wasn't a client. I hadn't been hired. But I had to know. My past and my present were about to collide, and I needed to understand the battlefield before I was inevitably dragged onto it. While I was analyzing the attack from my mountain fortress, my father was living through it in the heart of the storm. He was in his corner office at PCB headquarters, a space that had been his sanctuary of order for decades. But on that day, it was the epicenter of chaos. Phones were ringing incessantly. Panicked junior executives were running through the halls. The air was thick with the metallic tang of fear. Arthur, a man who thrived on control, was a statue of composure amidst the panic. He issued commands, delegated tasks, and projected an aura of unshakable authority. He was managing a crisis, but he was about to discover that the real crisis wasn't the one happening to the bank. It was the one happening exclusively to him. His inbox was a raging river of panic, a constant stream of urgent updates and desperate inquiries. But one email arriving at 11:02 a.m. cut through the noise. It wasn't from a colleague or a regulator. The sender was an anonymous encrypted address. The subject line contained just 4 words: "A private matter, Mr. Coleman." A chill snaked down his spine. He clicked it open. The message was brief, devoid of the usual hacker theatrics. We know the bank is just a business, but we also know about your business. We have everything, and we know you value your reputation above all else. Below the text was a single attachment. His blood ran cold as he read the file name, Arthur Coleman Misdeeds.zip. His world didn't just crack, it atomized. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. His hand, the same hand that had calmly cut his roast beef on Christmas night, trembled as it moved the mouse. With a click that felt like the pulling of a trigger, he downloaded the file. He didn't need to open it. He knew exactly what it contained, every shortcut he had ever taken, every questionable favor he had ever done for a wealthy client, every secret he had buried under a lifetime of starched shirts and feigned integrity. This wasn't about the bank's money anymore. This was about his life, his pension, his freedom. The hackers hadn't just taken his company hostage. They had taken his soul. He leaned back in his leather chair, the sounds of the frantic office fading into a distant roar. For the first time in his life, Arthur Coleman was truly, completely trapped. And he knew with a certainty that stole the air from his lungs that there was only one person on Earth who might have the key to his cage. 2 days after the news broke, I was sitting at my desk, mapping out the architecture of the PCB attack when the sound of a car engine disturbed the mountain silence. It wasn't the familiar rumble of the mail truck. This was a low, powerful purr. I looked out the window and saw a gleaming black Lexus, a car worth more than my first 2 years of business profits, navigating the final stretch of my gravel driveway. It looked absurdly out of place, like a shark in a fish pond. I felt no surprise, only a quiet sense of inevitability. The driver's side door opened, and my father emerged. He wore his expensive suit, the one he reserved for board meetings, but it hung on him differently now. He looked smaller. His hair, usually so perfectly combed, was disheveled, and his face, which I had only ever seen as a mask of cold composure, was ashen. His eyes were wide with a terror I had never seen before, the eyes of a cornered animal. He stood there for a moment beside his car, looking at my modest wooden house, as if it were a foreign embassy he needed a visa to enter. He took a hesitant step forward, then another. I didn't move from my desk. I simply watched him approach, letting him cross the distance he had created between us. He stopped at the bottom of my porch steps, looking up at me through the window. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out at first. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. "Evelyn," he finally managed to say, his voice a rough, broken whisper I barely recognized. I need your help." I remained silent, letting him stew in his own desperation. "It's not just the bank," he stammered, the words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "They know everything, Evelyn. They have a file. My name is on it. They're going to ruin me." I let the silence stretch for another few seconds, a silence filled with the ghosts of Christmas past, of a daughter being called a burden. Then I spoke. My voice was calm, steady, and utterly devoid of emotion. My company, Aegis Analytics, handles crises of this nature. Our retainer for emergency consultation is $100,000, payable immediately. Once the funds are transferred, my team and I will begin our assessment. He just stared at me, a man drowning, and I had just thrown him a life raft made of ice. But it was a life raft nonetheless. He nodded a single defeated gesture. The power had shifted. He knew it. And so did I. The $100,000 appeared in my company's bank account less than an hour later. The speed of the transaction was a testament to my father's desperation. With the contract digitally signed, I became more than his daughter. I was his last hope, and he was now my client. My team and I went to work. From my mountain command center, I coordinated with Sarah in Atlanta and 2 other specialists I brought on for the project. We didn't set foot in the bank. We didn't need to. We were ghosts in their machine, moving through their crippled network, analyzing the digital debris the attackers had left behind. For 48 hours, I barely slept. I lived in a world of hexadecimal code and encrypted data packets. It was like navigating a dark, flooded labyrinth, searching for the single vulnerability that would let us fight back. My father called 3 times, his voice tight with anxiety, asking for updates. I kept my replies brief and professional. We are making progress. That was all I gave him. On the 3rd day, I found it. It was a subtle flaw in the malware's command and control protocol, a tiny crack in their fortress wall. It was the digital equivalent of an unlocked back door, and it was all I needed. I didn't just want to neutralize the threat. I wanted to understand it. I wanted to see the faces of the people who had brought my father to his knees. So I didn't just block their access. I turned their own weapon against them. I launched a counteroffensive, a silent surgical strike that bypassed their defenses and gave me access to their primary server. The feeling was electric. I was inside. Their server was a digital treasure trove of chaos. I saw the stolen data from a dozen other companies. I saw their plans for future attacks. But I was looking for something specific. I found a directory labeled Active Extortions. And inside that directory, I found a folder named PCB. Within that folder were 2 key items. The first was the file my father feared, Arthur Coleman misdeeds.zip. The second was something far more powerful. It was an automated script, a digital dead man's switch. It was programmed to execute a single command if the hacker's server went offline for more than 60 seconds, publish everything. Every stolen file, every secret, every ounce of leverage they had. It was their insurance policy. But by gaining access to their server, I had also gained control of their insurance policy. I could disable the script, I could delete the files, or I could trigger it myself. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. The power to restore my father's world or to utterly annihilate it was now mine. It was a single line of code, a single command. The weight of that power was immense, a heavy, intoxicating presence in the quiet of my office. The ultimate reckoning was at hand. I let my father wait for another hour, an hour where he would be stewing in his fear, replaying every mistake he had ever made, an hour where he would be praying to a God he didn't believe, in a God whose power I now held. Then I picked up my phone. He answered on the first ring, his voice a ragged, hopeful gasp. "Evelyn, did you find anything?" "I've found everything," I said. My voice was calm, almost unnervingly so. It was the voice of a surgeon before the first incision. "The malware has been neutralized. I have control of the attacker's server." A wave of pure, unadulterated relief washed through the phone line. I could hear him exhale a long, shaky breath. "Oh, thank God, Evelyn. Thank you. I knew you could do it. I cut him off. "I also found a very interesting file, Dad," I said, using the word for the first time since that Christmas. "It's called Arthur Coleman misdeeds.zip. And I found the script the hackers wrote to publish it, along with all the other bank data, directly to the press and the federal regulators." The silence on the other end was absolute. The relief vanished, replaced by a cold, dawning horror. "I'm looking at the script right now." I continued my tone, conversational as if discussing the weather. "It's quite elegantly written. I have 2 options here. I can execute the command to restore a clean backup of the bank's data and delete the hacker's files permanently. Or I can execute the command to send everything, your file included. I just wanted to call and get your input. So, Dad, tell me, give me one good reason why I shouldn't just push the button and send your entire legacy of secrets to every news desk on the East Coast." I heard a sharp intake of breath, followed by a sound that I will never forget. It was a sob, a dry, choked, pathetic sound. The sound of a man's pride being shattered into a million pieces. "Please," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Don't. Please, Evelyn. I was wrong. I was wrong about everything. I'm sorry." It was the apology I had waited 2 years to hear. And now that it had arrived, it meant nothing. It wasn't born of regret. It was born of terror. I let his plea hang in the air, a final desperate note in the symphony of his downfall. He was no longer a king in his castle. He was just a terrified old man begging his daughter for mercy. And I was the one who held the scales of justice. His apology hung in the dead air between us, a pathetic hollow thing. I let it dissolve into nothing. An apology born of terror is not an apology. It is a negotiation. And we were not negotiating. "I am not going to destroy you," I said, my voice as cold and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. "That would be too easy. It would make me a monster, and I have worked too hard to let you turn me into one. Instead, you are going to pay, not with your ruin, but with your legacy." I could hear his ragged breathing on the other end of the line, the sound of a man waiting for his sentence. "First," I continued, "you will draft your letter of resignation from the bank, effective immediately. The reasons cited will be personal health concerns. You will walk away quietly, and you will fade into obscurity. Your 40-year reign is over." There was a choked sound, a strangled protest that died in his throat. He knew better than to argue. "Second," I said, moving to the heart of the matter, "you will go to your personal investment account, the one you have nurtured your entire life while my mother's medical bills piled up. And from that account, you will write a single certified check for $500,000. I let the number sink in. I knew it was a substantial portion of his net worth. It was a wound that would bleed for the rest of his life. "You will not be writing that check to me," I clarified. "That money will be the founding donation for a new scholarship fund. I've already chosen the name, the Linda Reed Memorial Scholarship for Women in Technology. Your money, the money you valued more than your own family, will be used to empower a generation of brilliant young women to enter the very field you never understood and always dismissed. You will fund the future you tried to stifle in me." The silence that followed was heavier than any I had ever heard. It was the sound of a man's entire worldview being dismantled. "Those are my terms," I concluded. "They are not negotiable. You will do this, and in return, I will execute the restore command. I will bury your secrets. You will have your quiet retirement, and I will have my justice. Do you understand?" A long, agonizing moment passed. Then a single defeated word came through the phone. "Yes." "Good," I said. I hit the enter key on my keyboard, executing the restore script. Then I ended the call. The price had been set, and the payment had been accepted. 3 months passed. The winter snows melted from the mountains, and the first green shoots of spring began to push through the cold earth. It was a season of new beginnings, and I was about to plant a forest. I stood on a warm, brightly lit stage, looking out at a sea of expectant faces. I was at a tech industry gala in Philadelphia, an event celebrating innovation and leadership. The polished wooden podium in front of me felt a world away from the cold dining table where my life had been torn apart. It felt a world away from the solitary cabin where I had pieced it back together. My hands didn't tremble. My heart didn't race. There was only a profound sense of calm, a feeling of rightness. Sarah was in the front row, beaming with pride. Beside her were representatives from some of the most influential tech firms in the country. They were all here for the announcement, my announcement. I cleared my throat and began to speak. Good evening. My name is Dr. Evelyn Reed, and I am the founder of Aegis Analytics. But I am also the daughter of a woman named Linda Reed. My mother wasn't a programmer or an engineer. She was a woman who believed in the quiet, steady power of nurturing things. She tended to her garden with the same care she tended to her family. And she taught me that from the hardest soil, the most beautiful things can grow. I took a breath, letting the memory of her fill me. In her memory, and with the belief that talent is everywhere, but opportunity is not, I am deeply honored to announce the formation of a new foundation, the Linda Reed Memorial Scholarship for Women in Technology. A wave of applause rippled through the room. I waited for it to subside before continuing. This scholarship is not about charity. It is about investment. It is an investment in untapped potential, in the brilliant minds that will shape our future minds that might otherwise be overlooked or dismissed. It is founded on the principle that your value is not determined by the circumstances you are born into, but by the fire you have inside you. This is not about looking back at what was broken. It is about building what can be. My father's $500,000, the sum of his bitter pride, was now the seed money for something beautiful. It was a poison that I had transmuted into medicine. The check had cleared, the foundation was established, and the first recipient had already been chosen. I looked out at the crowd, my voice clear and strong. It is my great pleasure to introduce you to our first ever scholarship recipient. I had done more than just win. I had taken the pain he had inflicted, and I had used it to build a legacy. Not a legacy of revenge, but one of hope. It was a legacy my mother would have been proud of. And in the end, that was the only victory that truly mattered. Today, I find myself back on the deck of my house in the mountains. The air is cool and clean, carrying the familiar scent of pine. I'm not working. My laptop is closed, sitting on the table inside. For the first time in a very long time, I am simply watching the world, feeling the warmth of the afternoon sun on my face. This deck was once my command post, a strategic outpost in my war for survival. Now, it is just a place to be at peace. I think about my father sometimes, but the thought is no longer a jagged piece of glass in my heart. It is a distant echo, a story about someone I used to know. I heard through a former colleague that he took the early retirement, sold the house on Belmont Street, and moved to a condo in Florida. He got the quiet, anonymous life he wanted. He is a ghost in a story that is no longer about him. This story is mine now. My phone, resting on the arm of my chair, buzzes softly. It's not a client. It's not a business alert. A single email notification lights up the screen. It's from the Foundation's administrative account. The subject line is simple, but it carries the weight of a new world. First scholarship awarded. I open the email. There's a name, a university, a field of study in advanced cryptography. There is a short, heartfelt thank you note from a brilliant young woman. I have never met a woman whose future will now be a little brighter. A woman who will now have a chance she might not have had otherwise. A smile touches my lips. It's not the ghost of a smile I managed after my first contract born of validation. It's not the cold, thin smile of victory I felt after my father's defeat. This one is different. It's warm. It's real. It reaches my eyes. I thought for a time that justice was about balancing the scales, about making the person who hurt you feel the same pain. But I was wrong. Real justice, the kind that heals you, isn't about tearing something down. It's about building something better in its place. It's about taking the poison you were fed and turning it into medicine, not just for yourself, but for others. I lock my phone and place it face down. I lean back, close my eyes, and just listen to the sound of the wind moving through the trees. The cycle of revenge is over. A new cycle, one of empowerment, has just begun. And in the quiet of my mountain, I have finally found true, lasting peace. Evelyn's journey teaches us a powerful lesson. Your worth is never, ever defined by those who refuse to see it. And sometimes the greatest victory is not in destroying the person who wronged you, but in building a life so full and meaningful that they become an insignificant footnote in your own incredible story. Many of us have felt like a burden at some point, or had our sacrifices dismissed by the very people we made them for. What part of Evelyn's journey resonated with you the most? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you believe that a person's true value always shines through in the end, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to Justice Chronicles so you never miss a story of vindication. Thank you for listening.